Okay, proceed.
All right, welcome. We're going to be presenting on the polar vortex. We are the SHARK team. We're presenting the Congressional Committee, or Subcommittee on Ubiquitous Climate Catastrophe. First going to be presenting is Ainsley Taylor. She's a data scientist from the Platinum Insurance Company. She studied at Yale. Then we're going to have Samantha Edge, who has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Then we have Alexander Erwig, who has a PhD from public policy management from Harvard. And then I'm Bradley Wilson, and I'm a slide management executive for Duba.
Hello, honored members of the Congressional Subcommittee on Ubiquitous Climate Catastrophe. Today, my team and I will be respectfully presenting to you an increasingly urgent and as yet unaddressed natural disaster that has progressively damaged and paralyzed vast swaths of the United States every winter. I am talking about the polar vortex. Imagine in America, gripped by snow and ice, its roads inaccessible, its people terrified, and its economic market already in a delicate stage of recovery, shuddering to a halt and even regressing. This is a future vision that is not so future anymore. What is a polar vortex, you may ask? Like many of your colleagues, and for much of the population, a polar vortex is not part of your common vocabulary. This is changing. Today, you may be learning for the first time that a polar vortex is a massive, swirling pocket of freezing air, typically located over the Arctic above us. Normally, this almost icy, hurricane-like weather system stays where it should in the north. However, but increasingly, changes in our climate have caused this frightful phenomenon to creep southward in the winter months, bringing with it conditions that have shattered low-temperature records and have decimated our expectations of what a winter should look like, such as when Florida experienced snow in the winter of 2014. As you can see, there are some words associated with the polar vortex, such as the big freeze, it's very cold, more snow, storm sequence, and snow in Florida. Some of these you've seen in headlines recently or this past winter, and you'll increasingly see them as the polar vortex becomes dominant in our mainstream media society. This is also a map taken of a polar vortex having come from the northern Arctic area down southward. As you can see, it's even reached to Florida and parts of Texas as well. This is alarming because a lot of what Florida and Texas don't have is infrastructure that can withstand temperatures that are unnatural for their region and their time.
So the polar vortex, or something you might more commonly refer to as a big freeze, lots of snow, things that you've been seeing more and more often in headlines over the last 5 to 10 years, that's going to become every year. So again here, if we go back to that map, you can see that the polar vortex essentially takes up, it'll come down and it'll affect half of America. And not only half of America, but the majority of our population is concentrated on this side. So most of the East Coast into Florida, all of the economy over there and the infrastructure is going to be affected by increased snow in the upcoming years. So what's the magnitude of this? What does that actually mean? Well, it's going to affect transportation industries. Insurance companies are already feeling the effect. Energy and infrastructure, and all of this, the bottom line is that it's going to have a significant effect on consumer spending, and already has. So moving forward, things that we saw last year, you guys I'm sure remember when the East Coast got a ton of snow, record levels in places like Boston. Essentially, cities shut down. Well, the transportation industries were affected, right? You can't drive in the snow. Maybe Boston and New York might be able to, but the people down in Florida, like, they have a little bit of trouble figuring out how to navigate ice sometimes. Flights were grounded. Over 20,000 flights were grounded in just 1 week in January 2014. And major airlines lost about $1.4 billion in total. So that's a significant damage.
Check it out. All of you who are funded by Boeing
any other major airline industry, take notice of this, because they're not just going to sit around while their profits are decreasing and while they know that you could be doing something right now to make it so that they're able to actually fly in these regions, right? All that they need is some attention paid to airports, for example, so that they can actually land their flights, and they are perfectly aware that you have this information and that you could very easily be doing something here. And if you don't do something like that, maybe they'll do something to, I don't know, the candidate that'll be challenging you in the next political election. Newsflash.
So not only is it the transportation infrastructure, it's the physical infrastructure of cities as well. Roofs or buildings with flat roofs, they collapse. Pipes burst. Anything that's metal contracts, and that can be incredibly damaging to cities. So essentially, that's a huge problem for the insurance companies, who in the last 10 years have spent about $30 billion on insurance. As you can see on the slide here, the projected costs as winters get worse and worse is about $6.2 billion every year. So if we spend about $30 billion in the last 10 years, it's going to change to about $70 billion in the next 10. That's double what we spent. So insurance companies pay for frozen pipes. They pay payouts for people who tried to drive in the snow and got hurt. Health insurance for people who slipped. Hypothermia-related hospitalization, that sort of thing. So energy, also the energy industry takes a hit when this happens too, because if you think about the way that energy is produced, energy companies are very well prepared for an estimated demand on their system, right? But when a bad winter hits, something that they weren't expecting, and tons of people are inside cranking up their heaters using more and more energy, the energy industry isn't ready for that kind of demand on their system, and it's incredibly costly to produce that high amount of energy in such a short time for them. So the bottom line here really is consumer spending. As Ainsley mentioned, our economy is just now recovering from a pretty decent-sized recession, as I'm sure you're all aware. So when people can't leave their house, kids' schools get canceled, right, because pipes burst in the building or nobody can drive to school. Parents have to stay home because they can't drive or their kid isn't in school. Nobody goes to work, nobody makes money, nobody goes to the stores, and it takes a toll for sure on consumer spending in the local regions. And this is over half of the United States and where the majority of our population is concentrated. So here's the economic impact of a few of the bigger storms in recent years. As you can see, the bottom line here for the big storms is about $5 billion, and it's gotten as expensive as $15 billion in the most recent 2013-2014 peak. This storm was the most recent big one to hit in recent years, so infrastructure wasn't prepared. We didn't really have the equipment to dig cities out of snow, so we had to spend a lot of money on repair and rebuilding there. The $7 billion in 2014-2015 was a little bit decreased, even though in some places like Boston, the snow was worse. We already had some of the infrastructure built up at that point from our spending in 2013-2014. However, as these storms get worse, expect to see that number climb every year, essentially because we're going to have to keep replacing the equipment that we used to dig ourselves out of snow the last year. Something else about winter storms, something that's hard to track in dollar amounts, they're about 24 times more deadly than reported estimations by the government. This is according to a study out of the University of Georgia that it was a 15-year study that tracked the number of people that were reported dead. I think the government likes to say that about 571 people died in a 5-year period. When you take into account transportation-related disasters, that number climbed to almost 14,000.
And these 14,000 people, they are not isolated individuals that live by themselves in a secluded area, right? They have children. They are children of families, right? They have an entire extended net of people that wants to see something done about this so that this number doesn't double or triple when the storms become more severe over the next several years. So that number is easily over 100,000 when you just think of the connections and the relatives that have been impacted by the ripple effects of seeing their children freeze to death in these polar vortexes. So the likelihood that this will occur You all know that winter happens. It's a season. It's one of 4 seasons. That season happens every single year with a 100% probability. You can look at all of these graphs. First of all, here you see the forecast for 2016 and 2015 and 2016. This is the temperature anomaly that will hit the United States. In English, that means that this is going to be far colder than it normally is, right? You see here that the graph tells you that this will be several degrees colder in general, which you might not think has an immediate impact, but that small amount of cold difference makes it so that water pipes freeze, so that companies that are preparing for a certain temperature no longer are able to prepare or to be adequately prepared for that temperature to hit. Additionally, if you look at this is an indication of how bad the polar vortex could get, which you can see here. This central region down here, it's almost not even able to be graphed anymore how severe that's going to be, because it's just moving in down from the Arctic and taking with it essentially the entire eastern seaboard. And even down here in Florida, all of that's affected. So while, yeah, Boston may have some snow plows or some ability to deal with excess snow, Georgia or Alabama doesn't know what snow is, much less is ready to handle 3 or 4 feet of it. So that's extremely significant, and all of you should take note of this, because most of you are from a state that's in the east, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be on this Polar Vortex Climate Committee. So your constituents all through here, over half of the United States is affected by this, and you should pay attention to that. Additionally, you can see the snowfall in terms of a normal percentage of the normal, right? You have a lot of snowfall here near the north, which is fine. They're relatively ready for snow. The main issue up there is the increased temperature, or the decreased temperature rather, but the very big issue right here is this 200% normal snow levels, which is something that no city is prepared for, because even now they're overspending money on trying to desalt roads, trying to remove snow from the roads, which means that a 200% increase of that will correlate to a far larger monetary spending, because they're not, haven't budgeted that into their existing budget, but additionally they just do not have the resources or the manpower to handle something like that. And this is just in 2015 to 2016 that we're showing you these graphs of. Every successive year there's a strong likelihood that it'll get worse, because the polar vortexes have been intensified, and as you all know, winter happens every year. So this isn't a $6 billion one-time impact, right? It's a $6 billion recurring every year at minimum impact, which means that within the scope of 5 years, you have at least $30 to $50 billion that you're going to be concerned about.
So, how can we possibly mitigate such assured and crippling damage? The first step is one that this congressional subcommittee is already engaging in: the education of all those who will be affected by the event. Like an earthquake or tornado, a polar vortex too can be integrated into the population's understanding of a natural disaster. And just like an earthquake or tornado, we need to teach your constituents and fellow American citizens how to stay safe and confident in the face of a polar vortex. The second step would be to actually mitigate the economic damage. Currently, industries such as transportation, insurance, and energy corporations have little to no complex systems in place to deal with the conditions a polar vortex will bring, and as a result, they bleed vast amounts of money trying to piecemeal compensate for canceled flights, private and public property damage, energy shortages, etc., etc. Instead, a set system in place activated in the event of a confirmed polar vortex parameters will greatly increase efficiency and reassure the public that the problem is being recognized and that they are being taken care of. It is in these moments, I will add, that your presence will be most strongly felt, and the relief they will experience will be linked to your names should you add them to this project. The third step to mitigate the damage of a polar vortex is to simply physically restructure our built landscape. More durable roads, roofs that can withstand greater weight from snow and ice, and community shelters for when conditions become life-threatening, among other changes, such as said already. All of these and more will allow us to be able to go to work, to send our kids to school and not worry about them being stuck there when conditions worsen, and in general to continue functioning both economically and physically. So how can we recover quickly from a polar vortex event? To both recover during and after a polar vortex event, immediate priorities would be access to a supply of clean water within the community, dried and nutritionally dense food, and shelter in the event that yours was damaged, as well as a simple yet effective emergency plan to smoothly transition from the event to rebuilding efforts and reassumption of our daily lives. The best way we can mitigate a polar vortex event is to be prepared for it, and then once it is over, to continue with our lives such that we're not dragging behind economically or physically or with any kind of ill effects. Today, these are not radical steps, and indeed have been adopted many times for other natural disasters. The Today, we have identified that the polar vortex has grown so dangerous and common that it can easily be listed among its fellow natural disasters, and as such, necessitates such proactive steps.
Specifically, we know that $6 billion a year is going to be at the minimum level that the polar vortex is going to cost the individual taxpayer. So we've identified several steps and are going to ask for funding that is far below that $6 billion level and is a one-time investment, which means that you'll be saving not only billions each year, but you'll only be investing a set amount right now. The first step that we've identified is funding FEMA and giving FEMA the capability to reimburse cities for actions that they take against polar vortex mitigation. So we've estimated this at approximately $5 million per major city. This is all of the emergency measures that they need to take, for example, on desalting roads, on having emergency bulldozers come in, and well, not bulldozers, right, but snow plows, who clear the snow off the streets and have the ability to mitigate the actual impact as it's occurring, because we don't always know when it's going to be most severe or exactly which resources which city will need. So for individual cities, FEMA can then reimburse them, which means that they won't have to bear the economic burden of that, which means your state individually won't have the economic impacts of the polar vortex. FEMA will be covering for it. That helps you politically as well, because it means that you'll no longer have to be concerned about your cities losing economic potential, and instead the federal government will be paying for it in a very convenient manner. The next step is power plant weatherization. This is one of the most important steps that we can take in order to reduce the likelihood of power outages and prepare plants for future polar vortexes. The estimate currently federally is that we would save an average of $2.4 for every $1 invested, which means that if we invested $100 million in power plant weatherization, we would get a return of, just through that weatherization, $240 million, which means that step pays for itself. Power plant weatherization is really simple. You basically make the power plant warmer and able to withstand temperatures that are more extreme, so that it can then have the ability to deliver power at a consistent pace to all of the citizens. That means there's no spikes in power consumption, and it also means that there's no rises in consumer power, so they don't have to pay for that. That means that consumers are happy because their prices aren't spiking, and power companies are happy because they've already budgeted these levels at a certain point. Next, we want to also have home weatherization in order to make individual homes have to draw less energy. This is already a program that's occurring for just low-income households, but we propose allocating an additional $100 to $200 million in funding to weatherize individual homes. First of all, that'll save on energy costs throughout the year because those homes will be more efficient, won't need to be heated with as much energy. But second of all, during the event of a polar vortex, it means that they won't be overdrawing on the power grid, not causing blackouts, and overall making the power companies more able to supply their customers with reliable energy. Finally, we need to invest in wind energy for the eastern seaboard. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking we need wind energy to stop all those harmful greenhouse gases. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about wind energy to save consumers money. Just in 2013 to 2014, during the polar vortex, existing wind energy saved consumers $1 billion in excess cost. That's a huge amount if you think about the investment that we would need, which is about approximately $500 million, which would build over 100 new turbines. We could see a $2 billion or even a $3 billion savings by the time the next polar vortex rolls around, meaning it would practically pay for itself. In total, our investment is far less than $1 billion. It's a couple hundred million, which pales in comparison to the 30 or 50 billion that'll be costing us, that the polar vortex will cost us over the next 5 years.
All right, so we've got a political cartoon here for you guys. As you can see, these polar bears have come down to the United States because up in the Arctic, they no longer have any ice. So as it says, can you grant us asylum? You have far more ice than where we've come from, and this is the Border Patrol effort from Canada to the United States. So.
Okay. Thank you.